We're going to begin to talk about a couple things that are going to be starting here in the next week or two and then the next 2 months. And so today I've given us the title of Tips on Having... That is my wife calling me. You hear it? It says, "It's the wife. Warning, warning, it's the wife." Now, you know, Becky's home sick. Becky, I may have to take that at some point. But would you just keep Becky in prayer? She's been having some problems in her stomach. We're not real sure what it is, but they haven't quite gone away. Lynn, just check, make sure there's no emergency. Thank you. So we're going to look at Acts chapter 8. I'll just get right to it. We're going to look at Acts chapter 8. And what we're going to see here are some tips on having spiritual conversations, Within the next 2 weeks and also within the next 2 months, New Life Fellowship is going to begin 2 programs that I believe our community, our church, our community is absolutely desperate for. Now, we have talked about them before, but today I want to share a way that you can help support the work that we are embarking on here. And the 2 programs that we are starting is in 2 weeks. The first program is called Freedom from Anxiety and Depression. It's going to be Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock right here. And then we're hoping within 2 months, we're going to begin our Celebrate Recovery program, a program for every hurt, hang up, and habit that we have. And there's ways that you can support and help these programs succeed by reaching out to other people and inviting people to come to them. Now, to invite people to come to something like these programs is going to require something that we're not always comfortable with, and that's having a spiritual conversation with another person. Thus, we're going to take a look at what it's going to show us in Acts chapter 8. Now, what I mean by a spiritual conversation is exactly what it sounds like. A conversation that you are willing to bring God into. If there is one message that is very clear in the New Testament, it is that followers of Jesus are supposed to have spiritual conversations with others. And so today's big ideas, using Acts chapter 8 as our reference, we're going to look at some of the things that need to happen when God wants to use us to have a spiritual conversation with another person. So first off, let's just read the text that we're going to be working with. Acts chapter 8, verse 25. Acts chapter 8, verse 25. And I'm going to read, Carly, did I give you, yeah. We're going to read a little further than this. We'll get the whole story and then come back. And so, Acts chapter 8, verse 25, I'm reading from the New American Standard. If you have a different version, yours might be worded differently, but the messages are pretty much consistent. So here we go, verse 25. And so, when they had solemnly testified and spoken the word of the Lord, they started back to Jerusalem and were preaching the gospel to many villages of the Samaritans. But an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, "Arise and go south to the road that descends from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert road." And he arose and went, and behold, there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure, and he had come to Jerusalem to worship. And he was returning and sitting in his chariot and was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, "Go up and join this chariot." And when Philip had run up, he had heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and said, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And he said, "Well, how could I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to come up and to sit with him. And we're going to stop there for today because we're never actually going to get that far. We're just going to look at the very first 2 verses. They seem rather innocuous, but they're pretty important, verse 25 and 26. And so let me just give you a little bit of background. Acts 8:25 is actually the beginning and the end of another account in the Bible. Now, at this point in church history, the message of salvation of Jesus Christ rising from the being crucified and rising from the dead, at this point in church history, that message had only been shared with the Jewish nation in Jerusalem. And many people who followed Jesus at that time actually believed that it never was supposed to go outside of the Jewish nation. But in chapter 7, something happened that began to change that, because in chapter 7, that early church, those apostles and disciples, they came under persecution. And that persecution of the early church that began in Jerusalem started forcing these new Christians out of the city and into different parts of the surrounding country. And this disciple named Philip wound up in a place called Samaria. And he's sharing this new message about Jesus Christ with the people there, and he's having great success. It's going really well. In fact, it's going so well that he sends a message back to Jerusalem where the Apostle Peter and the Apostle John are. He says, hey, come, I need some help. And so these big wigs of the early church, Peter and John, come out and they're helping Philip, and they're spreading the news, and they're having wonderful success, and they feel now that their work is done, and they're leaving Samaria, and they're heading back to Jerusalem. And that's where we pick up our text in verse 25. And so the whole crew, an entire crew, is now heading back to Jerusalem from Samaria. They're going back to the home church, if you will, and it's while they're on the road that this account begins. And so verse 25 again, when they had solemnly testified and spoken the word of the Lord, they started back to Jerusalem. There they go. And we're preaching the gospel to many villages of the Samaritans. Verse 26, but an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, get up and go south to the road that descends from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is the desert road. Now, one of the very first things that I noticed about these verses is that when God was getting ready to send someone out, he didn't pick Peter or John. He didn't use one of the big wigs of that day. He went to this guy called Philip. Now Philip's been around a little bit before. He really has, and we read about him a couple other places in the Bible, but he is definitely not as prominent as Peter and John were. And that brings us to the very first point I want to make about having a spiritual conversation. You don't have to be, here's your tip, you don't have to be great to have a spiritual conversation with someone. If God's placed it on your heart, he can use you to do it. You don't need to have your pastor do it. You don't have to have an evangelist do it. You don't need to be a great Bible scholar to do what God has placed on your heart. Folks, if he has placed something on your heart, guess what? He wants you to be the one to do it. And so that's the very first tip. You don't have to be someone great. You don't have to know everything to have a spiritual conversation with someone. And so we see in verse 26 that this angel comes to Philip and basically says, don't follow the rest of the crowd. They're going to Jerusalem. He says, look, I'm going to send you elsewhere. And there's maybe another tip for us that we need to understand. When it comes to having a spiritual conversation with someone, we must be willing to go in a different direction. We must be willing to go in a different direction. We can follow the crowd and never go where God wants to use us, or we can become willing to go another way. Verse 26 tells us that the angel came to Philip. Now listen, wouldn't it be easier that if every time God wanted you to do something, an angel would appear? Poof. I want you to go to such and such. I want you to go to Panera Bread and talk to the guy making rye bread in the oven at 450 degrees, not the oven that's 325. That way you know which one, right? Wouldn't it be wonderful if every time God wanted us to do something that an angel would appear? But that's not how it happens, is it? In fact, if an angel suddenly appeared to me, told me to do something, it would be such an easier choice to make. It would be easier right up until I started to tell other people that an angel came and visited me. And then you'd start to look at me a little bit cross-eyed. Maybe you wondered what I was smoking. Did I bump my head? I mean, what's exactly going on that this guy is thinking that he's seen? And did I fall off of my rocker when this happened? And so let's be honest. If the only time we ever became willing to have a spiritual conversation with another person was when an angel physically appeared before us, we would never have a spiritual conversation. If the only time we're ever going to be willing to do something is when we get this gigantic undisputable sign, we're not going to do anything for God. But that's what happened here, but that isn't always what happened. So is there a way to make this verse a little easier for us to understand? And I think it is. The word angel in this verse is translated from a Greek word that means messenger, messenger. Now, in this case, this truly was a divine appointment. This truly was an angelic visitation that made it clear to Philip what he should go. But the most important thing that I want you to get out of this verse is if you are willing, if you recognize you don't have to be some great Bible wizard to share, if you're willing to go a different direction to be obedient to God, then here's what you need to understand about verse 26. Somehow, through something, in some way or someone, God is going to make it clear to you what you should do. Did you hear that? In some way, if you're willing to go a different direction to follow God, I promise you that in some way, He's going to make it clear to you what He wants to do. He will get the message to you that He wants you to hear. And maybe many of us here have probably already experienced a strong sense of a time that God wanted us to say something or to do something in a particular moment, or maybe to say something to a particular person. Listen, if you're a born-again Christian, Jesus lives inside of you. That's what the Bible teaches us. Jesus lives inside of you, and guess what? If He's inside of you, He'll find a way to get the message from here to here. He'll figure out a way to get that message of what He wants you to do, that 15 to 18 inches from your heart and His Spirit inside of you to your mind. He'll make it clear. You'll get what you're supposed to do. And so you just need to be willing to go another direction when He does. And verse 26, arise again. Let's see what else is in there. Arise and go south to the road that descends from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert road. Now, this portion of our text, just this little section here, leads us to another tip, and here's what it is. We don't always know why we're supposed to go a different direction. We don't always know why we're supposed to go. Did you notice that in this verse, the angel hasn't told him why he's supposed to go a different direction? He hasn't told him if he'll meet someone or do something. He hasn't given him any other helpful information. He just tells him to go, and Philip obeys. Philip does it. Put yourself in his shoes for just a moment. If the group you are with is going one way, and for reasons you can't really explain to anyone else, you're suddenly going to go another, would you do that? If you were one of the crowd like that was here, would you be willing to go a different direction and follow God? I hope you would. The truth of it, though, is many of us don't. And then what's also really curious is Philip is also being sent to this road that's in the desert. He's going away from people. He's going out of the city. He's going to this desert, a barren place. He doesn't know where, and here's the thing, he doesn't know where this road is eventually going to lead him. The only thing he really knows is he's supposed to go, and that's enough for now. That's enough for now. He's going to be obedient to the message God has given him. And folks, when it comes to you and I having spiritual conversations, we need to do the same thing that Philip did. You see, our job as Christians is always obedience first to what God tells us. It's always obedience first. Just like Philip had to physically walk out into the desert, going the direction God has made clear to you is going to require you taking steps of faith on your part. Obedience to God always requires the action of steps of faith. Is that up there? Obedience to God always requires the action of steps of faith. That means you may have to walk into something, you may have to walk away from something, you may have to walk through something that's in front of you, but no matter whether it's walking into, away, or through, you're going to have to put your trust in God to get it done. It's trusting God in the dark until He brings the light of understanding to us. That's what faith is. It's trusting God in the dark until he brings the light of understanding to us. And so Philip followed God to a place that seemed empty and dry, but he went anyway. And when he took those steps of faith, God showed up with purpose and the plan that he had made for Philip. And look at how verse 27 starts. Verse 27 starts and says, and he, that's Philip, and he arose and went, and behold, wow, when he got there, suddenly understanding came. Now I'm starting to get why I'm supposed to be here, right? And so when it comes to us having spiritual conversations with another person, you and I may not know where that spiritual conversation that God wants us to have with someone is going to lead to. I don't know where it's going to lead to. I'm not a mind reader. You see, the truth is, we can never see far enough down the road to know how something is going to play out. But like Philip, we will know what direction God wants us to go. Because isn't that what we said about spiritual conversations? Jesus lives inside of you in one way or another, whether it's an angel, a person, a messenger. He's going to tell you what he wants you to do. He's going to make the message clear to you. And then as you begin to step out and to do what God wants you to do, that's when you'll see results. Philip, he didn't know what God wanted him to do, but somehow God's going to get the message. And so when it comes to these spiritual conversations, God will get the message to us that he needs us to hear. In that moment, we need to start to trust God by taking those steps of faith in the direction that God is sending us. If you're willing to start to take those steps of faith, God will take care of the rest. God will take care of the rest. Now, there's a lot to say here in these next verses, and I just want us to get just this one little nugget, just to kind of review our tips. A, God can use you. God can use you. If he can use me, he can use you. Trust me, right? But you've got to be willing to go a different direction. You maybe have to step away from the crowd to do these things that God puts on your heart. Another tip is God is going to make it clear to you what he wants you to do. And then you're going to have to take some steps of faith from there. And then as you start, and as it said in verse 27, he started, he arose, and behold, God began to reveal the plan that he had for Philip in that place. And so, if you remember, we started this conversation today talking about our anxiety and depression class, our Celebrate Recovery class that's coming. We believe that this is the direction we're supposed to go. We believe that we've received the message. And so we're heading a different direction. And that's what we're doing. And now we're starting to take those steps of faith to bring it in reality. And you've been helping us with that. But here's something I need to ask you. Is there someone that you need to have a spiritual conversation with? Is there someone that you know that you need to have a spiritual conversation with? A friend, a family member, a coworker? Somehow God has already gotten the message to you to talk to that person, and perhaps you're afraid of going in that direction. Perhaps you're afraid you don't know enough. That's okay. This is what I've learned. I don't have to know everything, but I've noticed this. Every time I've had a spiritual conversation with someone, every time I've taken a moment to pray with someone and over an issue that they have, the one thing that I've always noticed is they've always been appreciative. They've always thanked me. You know why? Because people want to know that you care. Before they care what you know about, they want to know that you care. And if you will stretch your hand out and just try to reach out a little bit, that's all you need to do. God will take care of the rest. Perhaps you're afraid and go in that direction. Don't be. If God has already given you the message to talk to someone, he already has a plan for how he's going to use you in that process. And you know, let's take it away from other people. Let's take for a moment and take our focus away from other people who might need help. And maybe we need to have some spiritual conversations with ourselves as well. You know, people shy away from groups like these about anxiety and depression because we've attached stigmas to these type of things. That we have issues with people that are depressed or all of this all the time. But folks, if you were having trouble with your eyesight, you would have no problem going to see an eye doctor. If you had problems with your heart and the doctor prescribed medication, you would have no problems with taking that medication. We don't attach stigmas to those type of things. But why? Why do we attach a stigma to something from, what is wrong with a person who suffers from anxiety and depression? Why do we attach a stigma to something that is clinically diagnosable? Something that can be helped, something that can help that person, that can help you, that can help me. And so you may recognize inside that you struggle from anxiety. You may recognize that you struggle from depression, but you're embarrassed and you don't want to say that out loud. There will be no stigma here. This is, for freedom, Christ set me free. Don't submit to that yoke of slavery. And if you're struggling, the first spiritual conversation you need to have is with yourself, and come. We believe that God is opening this up for us to do. You know, it would take me less than a minute right now to literally just take a pencil and paper and write down 10 names of people who have told me that they're struggling with either anxiety or depression just in this month alone. I hear it all the time. I see it all the time. Is your name on that list? Do you need that help? Who do you know that's trapped in the chains of addiction? Who do you know that's being hurt by the actions of an abusive partner or an addictive family member? Who is it that God has already been sending you the message to talk to? I just want to remind you that God has placed us, his people, on this earth to be light in the dark places. That's what you and I are supposed to be, light in the dark places. If you haven't been thinking about having a spiritual conversation, maybe now's the time. Maybe you need to do exactly what I said. Take a pencil and paper and write down that list. You know, things like anxiety, oppression, hurts, hang-ups, habits, they go across all socioeconomic barriers. They go across every age group. They go across every gender. Every man, woman, child can be affected by these things. And we can see it in someone, and we know as plain as day that that struggle is there. Are you getting the message? Maybe that's the person you should share with. Maybe that's the person you should come alongside. Are you looking in the mirror and seeing things that you recognize aren't as they should be? Have that conversation with yourself and with others. Let's change the world that we're in. Let's change the world. Let's be light in the darkness. Does that make sense to you guys?